Right. So, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning, good night, or even good afternoon, everyone. So, in this video, I'm going to going to continue what we have left last week. So, last week you have learned a little bit about social psychology. So, I have introduced you to social psychology, its definition, its coverage, and its scopes, yeah, and how most the social psychologists do their research. And this week, you're going to learn deeper about the basic concepts and basic theories on social cognition. So we could say that you are now entering the real concept and real theories about social cognition. So you're going to be, but last week you just were introduced to the basic idea of social psychology. So in this week, you're going to learn the simplest form of social cognitive processes, and we have arranged the material of this course from the simplest structure or the simplest processes in social cognition to the most complex one. Yeah, so you're going to learn the basic and the simplest one, yeah, before then going forward to a more complex cognitive processes. So before we're talking about those processes, I think it's very important to clarify, yeah, the basic or common terms that we are going to use throughout this course. Yeah, so you may think that cognitive processes and thought processes would not be significantly different. Yeah, and mostly we use those two terms interchangeably. Yeah, interchangeably. And sometimes the definition between thoughts and also cognition could be somewhat overlapped, I would say. Yeah, so it's very important to clarify what we mean about thoughts and what actually cognition, yeah, that we're going to learn throughout this course. Yeah, so the first definition of thoughts, yeah, so we use thought that refers to any processes that basically happens in a more conscious processes. It means that thought or thinking, probably, yeah, in a more common terms or lay terms, it refers to any processes that happens in our conscious and in conscious process. So basically, this is something that you mostly aware of. Yeah, you're mostly aware of. And for example, if you learn a new concept in social psychology, for example, it means that you consciously update your information, and you try to enhance your understanding about several concepts in social psychology. For example, yeah, it means that the thought process, the learning processes, is mostly conscious. But what we mean about cognition, that we're going to focus more, that we giving a huge focus in this course, is that it's a more automatic process. It's something that we are not mostly aware of. Yeah, and this is happen. It actually happens more often than the process that happens that happens in our conscious state. Yeah. So why this is important? Because we use this process all the time, and it influences our behavior even much more than the conscious processes. Yeah. So we we form our impression about other people, or even we attribute some things, or we categorize information, yeah, that we perceive in our real world, and those processes are mostly actually behind the conscious processes. This is something underlying our conscious processes. And if we take a computer as an analogy to describe what social psychologist means by unconscious process, it would refer to the idea of operating system. So, for example, if you have a laptop, then the operating system of your laptop would be the cognition process. Yeah, so it serves as a medium. Yeah, it serves as a medium where any mental processes that could happen. Yeah, it could be it could be conscious, something that you are aware of, or it could be also unconscious, something that you cannot have a direct control. Yeah, you can't have a direct control over that processes. Yeah, and the first yeah, the first idea of social and social cognitive processes that we're going to learn after this is that the idea of um, social schema, and we're going to talk about it later. Yeah, what it means and how it works and how the mechanism behind the idea of social schemas. But in this course, yeah, when we revert to social cognition, in this course you're going to learn a very specific approach in social psychology that put their focuses on every cognitive processes, every cognition processes, both something that you're aware of and also something that you are not aware of, and it could also affect our social behavior and could be also impacted by our social environment. It means that this social cognitive process, this very specific cognitive processes, could be influenced, yeah, could be influenced by our specific circumstances or social circumstances, but it could also actively affect our our social circumstances through social behavior. Yeah, so it's basically a two-way processes. We are affected by our environment, but we could also affect our environment actively by performing social behavior. Yeah, so the first the first topic, the first idea of those social processes, yeah, those social cognitive processes, would be explaining how we form first impression to a stranger that we met first, yeah, that we firstly met. And that would be also quite relatable in your experience because this is your first year in university, and you are and you also you're meeting lots of new people, strange people, yeah, new people, I mean, yeah. So, and it's also it would be extremely interesting to learn how in general people would form an impression about others, yeah, when they first met, yeah. And this starts with a very basic theory, quite old theory in social psychology, that explains how people actually form impression about others when they first met each other. And the basic idea is that when you form an impression, yeah, to someone about someone that you just met, rather than focusing on the details, which is we're very bad at doing that. Yeah, we're very bad at paying attention to details. Rather than paying attention to details, to its parts, we would prefer to form a general and a whole idea of the person. So rather than focusing on its details, we're trying to form an impression, a whole impression on a person as a whole, yeah, as a general impression. So that's why some traits or some characteristics, yeah, of other people could be significantly important in forming this general impression. Yeah. So the idea of this configurable model proposed by Solomon asks, it basically how we perceive people, how we form an impression about other people, could be impacted by two types of traits, yeah, or characteristics, yeah. Those characteristics could play its part as a central trait, which means those traits or those characteristics would significantly affect how we perceive people. But there are also peripheral traits. This is traits or characteristics that we pay less attention to, so that even those peripheral trait change, we rarely pay attention to that change as well. So we're focusing more on central trait when it comes to forming forming general attention or impression on other people. Yeah, so I'm going to show you how Solomon came into this conclusion by explaining his study, his study about a configurable model. So basically, us had 4 different groups of people, so he had 4 different groups of people, and those 4 groups will be given they would be given a completely same set of characteristics of somebody, but there was a blank box here where us would fill those blank box with different adjectives according to those 4 groups. So the first groups would be given warm to fill the blank box here, and the second group they would be given cold, to fill the blank box here, and the third group they were given polite, polite here, and the last group they would be given blunt here. So basically they assess the completely same skill, the same traits, a set of traits, but the mere differences was only the one blank box where Solomon asked put different adjectives there. What's interesting about this experiment is that even though those groups were given the same set of adjectives, except one, except one blank box here, they interpret the whole impression of somebody with these characteristics quite differently. So for example, when this box filled with warm, here you can say that you can see here that the overall impression is quite positive. So those people in these groups, those participants in these groups, they mostly associate these people, the people with the certain characteristics with a lot of positive traits, positive other traits, which means that when we put warm in this blank box, it could disproportionately affect how those participants form an impression about people with these characteristics. But when we change warm with cold here, the result would be impressively negative, could be overwhelmingly negative. So we could see that here most participants in these groups, where they were given the sets of characteristics with cold here in the blank box, they tended to see this person as in a more negative light compared to someone who compared to the groups who were given warm here in the blank box. But interestingly, if we compare the participants, a group of participants who were given polite and blunt, as we see here, there were no actually meaningful differences between these 2 groups, which means that it doesn't matter if we put polite or blunt in this blank box, it wouldn't change the overall impression of participant in both groups. So this is why us came into conclusion that warm and cold could be central trait, because inserting warm or cold, it could disproportionately affect how people form an impression about others who has these characteristics. But polite and blunt, on the other hand, this is not a central trait, this is peripheral trait, which means that it would not affect how participants in both groups when they form an impression about others. So this is the basic idea of a central versus peripheral trait. So I think that would be the explanation how Ash came to conclusion about central and peripheral trait. But of course, because we're human, we often make mistakes, and mistakes is a part of our life, and there are also biases when we form impression about other people. So the first bias that happens quite often is that primacy and recency effect. This is something that as proposed as well. So primacy bias basically means that the first traits that came initially, in a social interaction would affect how we judge others, how we form impression about others. But it would affect completely disproportionately, quite disproportionately. For example, if you firstly were introduced to me, then the first trait that you sense, that you feel, that you felt came from me, was that I'm an unfriendly person, for example. Then the trait that came first, that trait that appeared first in our interaction, would be your overall impression of me. Then you would see me as an unfriendly person. Yeah. But on the other hand, there is also recency effect, which means that the trait or the characteristic that appear later would affect disproportionately how you would form an impression or general impression on others. Yeah. So it happens specifically when you firstly didn't pay much attention to the interaction, yeah, or you didn't have, or maybe you less motivated to pay attention, yeah, when you firstly introduced by some by other firstly introduced on others, yeah. So for example, yeah, when you when the orientation day, I remember that you were introduced to all lecturers in Faculty of Psychology, and I was also I was one of the lecturer that was introduced in that event, and I doubt that you would pay attention to the lecturers that were introduced on that day. So of course you wouldn't really pay attention when all the lecturers were introduced, because there were lots of them. But then later, after you started interaction with each of the lecturer, including myself, for example, then you start paying attention to traits, to my characteristics. So you would form an overall or general impression about myself. That's the easiest example, I would say. And other biases that also often happen, yeah, is that if we have a very little information about someone, that we first met, yeah, we tend to assume the best of them. So we tend to think positive, yeah. We tend to see someone in a positive light, rather than seeing them as a negative light, yeah. So in the absence of meaningful information, yeah, we tend to assume that people would be in their best form, yeah. It's very rare that people would assume otherwise, yeah, except when negative information occurs. And when negative information occurs about someone, then it would also affect it would greatly affect how you form an impression about others, because we are very sensitive to negative information, and it's really, really hard to actually modify your negative perception or negative impression about others when they were firstly came out, yeah. So why is that? Because we're very sensitive to negative information about others, because it's a part of our survival mechanism. So we're trying to avoid danger and threat, and also that, of course, if you heard negative information about someone that you actually first met, then you would use that, you would rely on that when making an impression, and it's really hard to actually change those negative impression, yeah. And other biases that often occurs as well is that physical appearances, and I think this is very common sense. We tend to judge people. We tend to form an impression about other people based on their physical appearances, and we cannot lie that attractive physical appearances would be would also affect how we perceive people. Yeah, and positive or attractive physical appearances would be associated with good traits or good impression or positive impression, while less attractive appearances would give you the otherwise. Yeah, of course, you would associate those less attractive appearances with many negative characteristics. So the idea that people would judge you on your physical appearances uh, in the light of in the condition or in the context where meaningful information barely exists, of course people will judge you based on your physical appearances. So and even people who are physically attractive, uh, lay people would associate those attractiveness with many good traits such as being interesting, warm, outgoing, socially skilled, and people would judge you as a good person as well. Yeah. And the second idea or the second concept of forming an impression would be, this is also the classic one, is that is cognitive algebra. So the basic idea is that how we form an impression is quite simple. Well, not quite simple, basically, but it follows the rules of algebra. Yeah. So basically, we combine the traits that we observe when we do social interaction with people that we just met. And also those operations includes summation, averaging, and weighted averaging. And basically, we're trying to look for when we try to form a general impression on others. There are traits that we think are more important, and some traits are less important. So that's why we put weights. Yeah, we put weights on different traits. It depends on the context of social relationship itself. And the idea is that's very simple. So when you meet someone who is intelligent, yeah, and sincere but boring, yeah, well, basically, if you want to form a general impression, you just try to combine those traits. And when boring is relatively acceptable negative trait, you would form a general positive impression to people who has these three traits. Yeah. But the idea is that if in the context and in the different context, you will put different weight on different traits as well. For example, if you meet someone who is intelligent, sincere, but boring, and you would see this person as a potential friend, then you would put more weights, more emphasize, I would say, you would emphasize more on generosity, for example, because having friend who is generous is extremely important, something that you would prefer mostly. Then you put more weights on generosity here. But if you see this person as a politician, for example, then you put different weights on different traits. Yeah. So this is the idea is quite simple actually. Yeah. So we put different weights. Yeah. We put different weights depending on the context of the social relationship itself. Yeah. And that would be the end of the first part of this lecture. And I'm going to continue to the second part with social schema.